In 1994, equal representation became a key foundation of public service reform in South Africa. This includes the representation of women. It was not until the introduction of the Bill of Rights that all women in this country received formal recognition as equal citizens. Government and the private sector have set out plans to give women equal opportunities in society. However, there remains some disparities in this quest. Tonight, we unpack the big question: why women are still fighting to be included in the economy, and why after so many years. We're now joined in studio by Professor Hlengiwe Mkhize, and she's the Deputy Minister of the Department of Telecommunications and Postal Services. Thank you very much for joining us, Deputy Minister.
Good evening. Thank you very much for having me.
Now, we've just wrapped up Women's Month, a very important month in South Africa where we celebrate, women who've sacrificed so much, and also looking at the plight of women in South Africa. You went around the whole country attending and hosting a series of events looking at different issues that women face. What are some of the pertinent issues that came out of those engagements with various women across the country?
I think, this month has really been a humbling experience because it gives us an opportunity to unpack the theme which we're given, moving South Africa forward. So as you got to different groups, you picked up the experiences and feelings at those levels. One of the things which stood out for me is that while many women appreciate the courage, the bravery, and the commitments and the leadership of the woman of 1956, you find that during interactions they will say very little about that, and they will quickly bring you back to one thing, that here in this area or in this group, if we can manage to deal with the question of poverty, then we'll be extremely happy and we'll appreciate our freedom and democracy. So that emerged as a very, very, what can I say? It was a pattern, almost like a pattern throughout. There was also a question of gender-based violence. People were still talking about terrible cases of what is happening. And unfortunately, they would say, yesterday this happened. We are rushing to court to represent people. A child was raped, or a woman, this had happened. So that also emerged very strongly. And for me, those two, really, I think we have to look at very closely. Gender-based violence, but the question of economic inclusion is almost like people were saying there's no family life without economic inclusion. We cannot preserve families if we're all unemployed. Poverty is our worst enemy. So that emerged very, very strongly.
And I'm actually glad that you mentioned economic inclusion, which is something I want us to unpack a little bit more. But before we get to that, another thing that you pointed out was gender-based violence. In your interactions with women, do you think women are feeling less and less protected? And I'm saying this because we're on the news every day, and every single day we read, or almost every day we're reading about another woman who's been brutally murdered or stabbed or abused in some way. And it seems like the murders and the violence against women is becoming more and more brutal. Is this something that you also picked up in the interactions with women?
There's one, we were in one of the municipalities here. The police were inside. I think they just walked in as well. And people were saying, look, there's a problem here. When you report, sometimes the case, one woman was relating a case saying, I've been going backward and forward to the police station, and they've done nothing over the past 2 or 3 years. So it's a big problem, the capacity of some of the local police stations. And sometimes, if you are in a big city, there are things you take for granted. If I go to Douglas State Police Station, I find it's interaction, it's cars, it's people. And in some of the smaller police stations, they still have a problem of saying, we have a problem with connections. We didn't have our phones were down.
But we didn't have vehicles to get to you.
Oh, the vehicles, they're even worse. And the staff capacity, the number is limited. So there are those issues that really upset communities. Of course, we're trying to motivate them that, the police are important, they represent the state. But also, when we started with this issue, we introduced, as government, Tutuzela centers, and in many areas today they don't know what you're talking about when you talk about Tutuzela centers, and they were meant to assist victims so that they don't go around looking for a district surgeon, looking for a prosecutor, looking for the police. Virtually everything
is in that one center.
And managed very carefully. This Office of Sexual Offences and Advocate Togo Machogweni, she's the one who started it, and it worked very well. But in many parts of the country, they don't even know what they were meant to do. So it means we've made gains, but I think because of capacity problems, sometimes we lose them. And another obvious problem is that for some reasons, we haven't been able to really strengthen our non-governmental organizations, especially around these pressing issues at a community level. And that's one of the things which economic inclusion, for sure, is a top priority. To talk to companies, that's what we're saying to them, that we will be talking to companies so that at a local level, if you were to supply goods to the municipality, at least you should be assisted by an established company. Otherwise, you'll take too long if you work on your own. And so that's going to be our approach, virtually, to go with companies to each and every group that is pursuing specific areas in the economy.
Let's further look at this theme of moving South Africa forward. It's a relevant theme, for the whole country, but especially for women in general. When you look at, a lot of small businesses in townships and in rural areas, they are started by women. We saw some being profiled throughout the month, where a lot of women have really built themselves up and have started businesses. But when we look at economic inclusion, when I say economic inclusion, I mean women running big businesses, starting big conglomerates and really making a huge impact on the economy. Are we still seeing that hostility, and what needs to be done to make sure that women are right up there in terms of running South Africa's economy?
Well, when it comes to that, you find that at the bottom, companies will say they'll give you a percentage of women. When you analyze deeply, you'll find that they are in administration. And sometimes you find that there will be a significant percentage at the middle level. But when it comes to the top, that's where the big problem is, up to the board level, except government boards where we always make sure it's 50-50. So, it calls for taking the NDP to them now to say, we have the triple BEE, but basically we need to have deeper conversations with them. I suppose as government, we have a huge responsibility to provide leadership and really push harder and make sure that these companies, they step up their effort, because they don't deny it. There's generally an interest and an agreement. But I think because it's economic power and huge interest, people are just not prepared to give away power. It's something which we have to take back to the drawing board and make sure that we specialize and begin to produce outcomes and results on a regular basis in terms of how well in this sector they're doing. Have they made any breakthroughs beyond having these women in ICT, which we moved around also with the private sector? And so we have to monitor that very closely.
And that's something I want us to look at also. You had the Women in ICT Awards recently. What are some of the programs that your department, the Department of Telecommunications and Postal Services, have put in place to empower women? And also what's the response from women? Are they taking part? Are they active and enthusiastic about those programs?
Sometimes we throw around words, and I would say it's stereotypes. Having just, up to around here in Gauteng, last week Sunday, You know, I went somewhere in Honeydew late at night. Women were still sitting. They've been there the whole day. They're so committed. They were telling examples of how they've tried to access finance through our entities like SIFA, CEDA, which is supposed to train them, and they say, oh, I've got everything, but nothing is happening. So there's this hunger and thirst. But of course, growth will emanate from commitments from established companies, because growth is when you begin to supply at a higher level. And you can only do that if you enter the network, the markets of the company that is incubating you and cushioning you. And of course, as government, we have to use our incentives strategically by ensuring that we are not taken for granted and there are no benefits for people, in terms of ensuring that women and our youth, of course, in any part of the world, young people in general, whether it's men or women, they don't have the track record, they don't have the skills. So without meaningful incubation programs and support, they're not going to get there. As a department, we're focusing on SMMEs. We're talking to our operation, for instance, MTN. You know, we've spoken to them. Vodacom, we've spoken to them. Our post office and CETA, almost all of them, we've said, let's look at industry-driven SMMEs. We have the policy in place, and we are talking to them so as to ensure that we begin to see the numbers of people who have been cushioned and they are growing, either as entrepreneurs or absorbed by the industry.
Now, moving from entrepreneurs to employees or to women in male-dominated industries, what are some of the challenges that women still face? Also, the ICT sector is another sector which remains predominantly, male-dominated. What are some of those challenges that women still face on a day-to-day basis in those sectors?
Well, the corporate culture is patriarchal and male-dominated. So, first of all, we have had a few women. For instance, in Telkom, we had a CEO. We all celebrated. She was the first. But today we have a CEO who is a man. So, which means, it's not the law, but there are barriers, institutional. Those are things which we have to work hard, especially with the private sector, and ensure that women, once they are in, they succeed. But I think also in a sector like the ICT, the big challenge is that it's supposed to be an enabler of sustainable development goals. So basically, it means people who are, everything is going to be digital, doing business, e-commerce. Yes. So if women are left out, and they are the drivers of family life and community life, it's going to make this country highly unequal. And it will widen the gap between the haves and the have-nots, because the women are in the majority. Hence, in the SMMEs, we are saying they should be absorbed in big numbers, but not to be left on their own, to be supported by specific companies, and then we evaluate from them.
And I think it's really important to look at those specific companies and to look at the private sector as a whole. I mean, you've mentioned some of the programs that government has put in place, but also the policies that government has. We've got the NDP, we also have the BBBE. But let's look at the overall role of the private sector and its importance in ensuring that government reaches its goals, because it should be a public-private partnership.
The private sector, they have a hub of skills. Resources, technology, finances. In South Africa, I think the introduction of the BE delayed us a bit, because much as it had 5 levels of empowerment levels, shareholding, management, skills, entrepreneurship, community development, the tendency, the private sector, they have these foundations which tends to focus on almost grants, handouts. They will go to an area, they'll do something. But also, then they'll have the entrepreneur development division, which will really assist people within the company. And so we haven't made breakthroughs in terms of ensuring that it's not about the entry, but it's about widening the scope and ensuring that as many people as possible are active players and successful players in the economy. Of course, what delays us sometimes is that due to legacy-related issues, the majority of citizens in this country are black people, Africans in particular. And our education didn't really expose us to the kind of qualifications that are needed today, like engineering, technology, So those things somehow, they've retarded our progress. But given the targets set by the NDP, and really the realization that when rating agents are looking at the country, they realize that you are no longer a young democracy, you have to begin to show maturity. And the private sector, they appreciate, I'm sure you see now they pronounce all the time, they appreciate the fact that it's going to have direct impact in them if investors see this country as unsustainable. Too many people are excluded.
And that actually makes a lot of sense, because once they start to appreciate that, then we can start seeing real action. So moving from the conversations, moving from the policies that are on paper, and actually seeing the real action. Let's look at funding, because I think that's really important. You mentioned now with the private sector where you say they've always looked at the bottom, either giving handouts or grants, etc. But let's also look at government funding. Is it adequate in terms of funding entrepreneurs, in terms of funding startups, in terms of skills development as well, that we need for the sectors to grow in order for our economy to grow, but also, to impress the ratings agencies?
Well, the strength of government is to use incentives to give opportunities that will help business to grow. Like in our case, people will say we want spectrum.
Yes.
And then, and so it helps them to grow their businesses. But also, this ownership, which has been circulating in the hands of the few, it also retarded progress, because then people will be convinced that, we're really doing well, not realizing that it's almost like they collude. They've been empowering one and the same guy. And so those are some of the things that we're looking at. But when it comes to government incentives, we shouldn't underestimate that. Look at trade and industry, what they've done with the automotive industry. But of course, we have to see more and more small startups benefiting from multinationals, not just one black-owned company, but actual incubation, using incentives to fast-track bigger numbers of entities.
We're running out of time, but just to wrap it up, something that's completely a side note, but a lot of South Africans and young people complain about it on social media. Yeah. That's the cost of data. We spend a lot of money on data. Data is very expensive. How far is government coming along with that broadband plan and that rollout? Where are we? Are we going to reach our targets?
Well, I think broadband rollout.
Yes.
The tenders have been out. Very soon we'll see people who will be deployed to roll out broadband throughout the country. That is on track. There's a budget put in place for that. It might not be enough. There'll be a need for partnership with the private sector. But some of the policies that the department is driving, they are clearly earmarked towards that, like open access. If government takes responsibility for infrastructure, that will allow, that will stop many of these things, like roaming, whereby when you get to another country. Then you are charged more. Yes. It's open access. And we work with the continent. If we can implement the strategies that we have in place, gradually, I think we are going to normalize the rates of our data.
Prof, it's always a pleasure having you. You're doing amazing work. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
That was Professor Hlengiwe Mkhize, the Deputy Minister of the Telecommunications and Postal Services Department. And she was talking to us about some of the work that they've done throughout Women's Month, but more importantly, how women can move South Africa forward as we go into the rest of the year. And of course, next year, we'll have more news for you after the break. Stay with us.